There's a particular kind of suffering that doesn't quite fit the word depression. It looks like depression from the outside. You've pulled back. Things that used to matter feel distant. You're sleeping more, or not at all. You cancel plans. The version of yourself that used to show up reliably, the one who knew what to say, who functioned, feels further away than it should. But depression isn't quite the word, is it? Because there's something underneath the heaviness that isn't emptiness, more like pressure, something pressing against the inside of the walls. And emptiness doesn't press. Tell me if this sounds familiar. You're not exactly sad. You're untethered. You haven't stopped caring. If anything, you've started caring about different things. The ones that used to feel urgent feel hollow. The ones you never gave yourself permission to want are suddenly the only ones that seem real. Jung had a name for this. He didn't call it depression. He called it the night sea journey. The term comes from ancient mythology. Jung borrowed it from the comparative mythologist Leo Frobenius, who documented the same pattern across dozens of cultures. The sun descends every evening and enters darkness. In mythology, a hero enters the belly of the whale, the underworld, the cave. And within that darkness, always within it, something essential is restored that couldn't have been restored any other way. Jung called this the nekyia, and he wrote about it in Symbols of Transformation, Collected Works Volume 5, not as metaphor, but as a specific recurring pattern in human psychology. The descent is not a malfunction. It is a reorganization. When what you've built, the identity, the life structure, the way you've understood yourself, no longer fits who you're becoming, the psyche initiates dissolution. It doesn't ask for permission. What that process looks like from the inside is very similar to depression. The difference is direction. Jung and the psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, who worked clinically with what he called spiritual emergency, identified the same distinction. Clinical depression moves away from meaning. The dark night moves toward it. The withdrawal isn't numbness. It's a quiet prioritization the conscious mind hasn't caught up to yet. There are 7 things that tend to mark this experience. None of them look like awakening from the outside. Most would pass for symptoms on a standard checklist, but they have a texture, if you know how to feel for it, that distinguishes them from simple illness. The first is that the old life has stopped fitting. You're still doing what you were doing, but it feels like wearing someone else's clothes. Correct on the surface, wrong underneath. Relationships, routines, the version of yourself you perform. Functional, but with a distance between you and them that wasn't there before. The second is that things that used to bring genuine pleasure no longer reach as deep. This gets called anhedonia. But there's another reading. What used to satisfy you was satisfying a self you've already begun to outgrow. The hunger is still there, looking for something more true. It doesn't feel like hope. It also doesn't feel like nothing. The third is a change in how you sleep, or in what happens when you do. Dreams become more vivid, more charged, more peculiar. Jung's understanding is that the unconscious is processing at a different depth than usual. More active, not resting. The dreams that arrive during these periods tend to be the ones people remember for decades. The fourth is a kind of intolerance for what feels false. Small talk becomes almost physically difficult. Social performances become exhausting in a new way. The capacity to pretend not to care about something you care about. It contracts. This usually feels like something has broken in you. Jung understood it differently. The feeling function is recalibrating. The fifth is questions you never used to ask. About why you're living the way you're living. Whether the life you're in is actually yours. Whether the beliefs you carried without examination still hold. Jung would call this individuation pressing through the structure you built before you knew who you were. The sixth is a particular loneliness in the presence of people who love you. Not estrangement, they haven't changed, but there's a frequency they're on that you can no longer access without effort, and a frequency you're on that they can't quite hear yet. This is what standing between identities feels like. The old one has loosened, the new one hasn't formed. Not because you're isolated, because you're between. The seventh is harder to name, something that isn't quite hope and isn't despair, a directional sense, not optimism. That would feel naive, just the quality of something moving, a pressure that has a forward orientation. Jung observed this signal consistently in people at the threshold of significant change. He considered it reliable enough to distinguish carefully from symptom. I remember a woman I worked with in my last year at the hospice. She was in her late 60s, ovarian cancer, third recurrence. And she would say something I didn't know how to hold at the time. She'd say, "I feel like I'm disappearing." I assumed she meant the body, that she was describing the approach of death. She wasn't. Over the following months, I watched her become less like who she'd been, and more present, less agreeable, more honest. She cried more and laughed more, absent of the low-level performance most of us maintain without noticing. She wasn't disappearing. She was releasing a version of herself she'd been carrying for 40 years. In her final weeks, she was the most awake person in the building. Jung described this as the nigredo, an alchemical term, the blackening, the first stage of transformation in every tradition he studied. Putrefaction, dissolution, the death of what was before anything new can form. The fixed form you've accumulated must become fluid before it can reconfigure. That doesn't feel like growth. It feels like loss, often specifically like loss of yourself. But what Jung observed across decades of clinical work and his own years between 1913 and 1916, when what others called a breakdown became the source of everything that mattered in his work, was this: the nigredo is not the end of the story. It is what the story requires before the next part can begin. The alchemist had a phrase he quoted: "You must endure the putrefaction with constancy, not solve it, not rush through it. Stay present inside it without abandoning yourself. I'm not telling you to avoid help if you need it. Some suffering is illness, and illness needs treatment. But there is a question worth sitting with. If what you're feeling has direction, if the emptiness has a quality of pressure rather than pure absence, if the withdrawal is selective rather than total, if underneath the heaviness there's something that moves rather than something that simply weighs, then the name you give it changes what you do next. Depression says something has gone wrong. The Night Sea journey says something is underway. You don't have to choose only one, but the question of which frame you're living inside shapes everything that follows. You're not falling apart. You might be falling into something. And if you've felt somewhere in the quiet underneath all of this, that whatever is happening has a direction, trust that more than you trust the noise.